The sound of her heels on the linoleum was sharper than the word goodbye. Emily didn't look back as she left room 304, where I lay half sunken in the white sheets, IV dripping like a clock that had learned how to bleed time. 2 hours earlier, that room had been just another corner of Stonemere Hospital. White walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to the curtains. I remember counting the dots in the ceiling tile above me, 36, while the doctor held my scan in trembling hands. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't need to. "Mr. Hale," he said, "it's Hodgkin lymphoma, stage 2. Something inside me sagged like wet wood under too much weight. My hands, once calloused from carving cedar beams, now shook as though they belonged to someone else. Before you continue, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where and when you're watching." Emily sat stiff in the chair by the window. The late Ohio sun caught the gold thread of her blazer as she finally spoke. "If you keep going like this," she said, her voice like polished glass, "you'll only drag the whole family down. Emily." My throat felt like sawdust. "I can fight this. I just need—" "You need to stop being weak." She rose, gathered her purse, and left before the echo of her words could settle. I had spent 20 years building our life from splinters, buying our $180,000 house on Maple Street, saving $80,000 in the joint account, shaping every weekend into something soft for our 3 kids. Yet in that moment, as the door clicked shut, it felt as if the entire frame of my life had been yanked from the wall. This wasn't just illness. It was the first fracture in what I had believed was unbreakable. Our perfect little family drama now splintering in silence. Wood is supposed to hold, but when rot hides inside long enough, it only takes one touch to collapse. I lay there, listening to the fading sound of her heels, and I wondered, had she just decided I was already gone? The house was too quiet when I came back from Stonemere Hospital that afternoon, the air heavy, as if it knew what had been taken. Dust hung like pale confetti in the sunlight through the blinds. The kitchen clock still ticked at 2:14 p.m., but the rhythm felt wrong, like a metronome left behind by someone who no longer played music here. I set my keys on the counter. The sound echoed across the empty space. The couch was bare, no throw pillows. The framed family photo from Maple Street, the one with Caleb's crooked grin, was gone from the mantel. "Caleb?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. There was no answer, only the refrigerator humming, steady and cold. I moved to the study where we kept the bills and bank files. My hands trembled as I logged into the joint account. The screen blinked, then showed a balance of $12.46. 6 weeks of hospital stays, and in that time, everything had been drained. I opened the recent transactions. One stood out like a red slash, $78,200 wire transfer to an unfamiliar account, executed the same morning my biopsy confirmed the cancer. A breeze from the open window shuffled papers across the floor, like ghosts of receipts fleeing from the scene. "Dad?" I turned. Caleb stood in the doorway, a note crushed in his fist. His voice cracked. "She left this." He handed it to me. The handwriting was Emily's. Perfect, deliberate. "I can't do this anymore, E." The pen had pressed hard enough to dent the paper, as if she wanted her absence to be carved into it. I sank onto the arm of the couch, the old wood frame creaking under my weight. How long had she planned this? Had she been packing memories into boxes while I counted ceiling tiles, thinking I still had time? It wasn't just leaving, it was precision. This wasn't grief, it was architecture. Caleb's voice broke the silence. "Did she think you were going to die?" I stared at the blank wall where our family portrait had been, and for a moment it felt like a courtroom, with me on trial for simply getting sick. "I think," I said slowly, "she already decided I was dead. Somewhere inside me, something small and sharp turned over. What had looked like heartbreak was starting to smell like deceit, a deliberate dismantling of the life I had built, nail by nail. The house was still standing, but the center had caved in. Every chair, Every room was a witness to her exit, and as I listened to the hollow silence, I couldn't stop wondering, if she erased me this easily, what else had she taken? Nights at Stonemere Hospital blurred together like watercolor left out in the rain. The halls whispered with the wheels of distant gurneys and the muted chime of elevator doors closing on other people's stories. My room smelled of saline and lemon polish, as if someone had tried to scrub away the fear, but only spread it thinner. The plastic blinds rattled each time the heating kicked on, reminding me of the workshop back on Maple Street, where I used to sand oak planks late at night. The air thick with sawdust and certainty. I had no such certainty now. The first round of chemotherapy left my body trembling, as if the marrow itself had learned to shiver. Each week, the billing office slipped a new envelope under my door, $3,217, $3,198, $3,246, as if they were keeping score. I lined them up on the tray table beside my untouched dinner. The mashed potatoes had cooled into a shape that looked eerily like the state of Ohio, gray around the edges. "Eat," said Sandra, the night nurse, setting down a fresh cup of broth. She was young but had eyes like old books, the kind that had seen whole lives turned and closed. "I'm not hungry," I muttered. "Even warriors need rations," she replied, adjusting the IV line with quiet precision. "Don't make me call in reinforcements." Despite myself, I let out a rasp of laughter that sounded more like a hinge. When she left, the silence folded over me again. My hair had started falling in thin strands onto the pillow, soft as autumn leaves. I found one clinging to the cuff of my gown and thought of Owen's habit of twirling my hair when he was small, how he would hum while I worked at the bench. The world still simple. I hadn't seen my children in almost 2 months. Emily had taken them to Chicago for stability, though I suspected it was more about convenience. Somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m., I caught myself talking to the ceiling. "Did you know," I whispered, "that wood only snaps after it stops bending?" The ceiling, like everyone else, had no answer. Every beep of the heart monitor felt like a courtroom gavel marking time until my verdict. Alone in that sterile cocoon, I wondered if this was what it meant to be erased. Not suddenly, but one invoice, one hair, one silence at a time. The phone felt heavier than it should have, as I held it to my ear that night, the plastic warm from my palm. Outside the hospital window, the parking lot lamps glowed like distant lighthouses over an ocean of asphalt. I hadn't seen Caleb, Nora, or Owen in 63 days. Time had begun to smear. The calendar pages on the wall had become more like accusations than markers of days survived. Emily had taken them to Chicago for stability. That was the word she had used. Flat. Administrative. Stability, as though our children were misfiled documents she needed to relocate to a safer drawer. When Caleb's voice came on the line, it was a whisper wrapped in static. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm getting through it," I said, my mouth dry. "How's school?" He hesitated. I heard the echo of a television somewhere behind him. Distant laughter from a world I no longer belonged to. "Mom's different here," he murmured. "She's always with this guy. His name's Victor. He drives a black Tesla Model S. He stays late." The words landed like nails dropped on tile. Victor. A name that sounded like polished shoes and contracts. I pictured him sitting where I used to sit at the dinner table, Owen showing him his Lego tower, Nora laughing politely. My chest tightened, as if someone had looped a measuring tape around my ribs and pulled. "Caleb," I said carefully, "promise me you're watching out for your brother and sister." "I am," he replied, his voice too old for 17. "But she doesn't talk about you anymore. Like, at all." The silence stretched. I could hear him breathing, trying not to sound scared. When we hung up, I sat back in the chair, and stared at the water stains blooming on the ceiling tiles above me. They looked like continents drifting apart. I imagined my children's faces on those drifting shapes, fading toward the horizon. A father is supposed to be a roof, but from here, I felt like smoke, thin, gray, slipping through the cracks while strangers moved into the rooms I had built. If this story stayed with you for a moment, support us by liking and subscribing. Every click helps us tell the next one. It was a Tuesday that smelled like antiseptic and regret when Mark Caldwell walked into my hospital room. He was carrying a briefcase the color of burnt coffee and a look that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, perhaps even at a dentist's office getting a root canal. He pulled up the plastic chair by my bed and sat like someone about to tell you your house had burned down. But at least the mailbox survived. "Richard," he began, flipping open the case with a metallic snap. "I wish this was about your recovery." I arched a brow. "That makes two of us." He slid a document across the tray table, right next to my untouched cup of gelatin. The paper looked official. County seal, notarized stamp, the whole bureaucratic circus. But my name was written in the corner like graffiti on someone else's wall. "That," Mark said, tapping it with a pen, "is the deed to your house on Maple Street, signed 3 days after you were admitted here. By you. Allegedly." My laughter startled even me, brittle and too loud in the sterile air. "Funny. I must have signed it between vomiting and hallucinating ceiling squirrels." Mark didn't smile. "Emily forged your signature, Richard. The house has been transferred to a holding company, owned by her." For a moment, the room tilted. My IV pole seemed to lean away from me, like it didn't want to be associated. My hands closed around the paper, and it crackled as if it were on the verge of catching fire. "I built that place," I said, voice low. "Nailed every beam, sanded every stair tread, replaced the roof shingles one summer in 100-degree heat, while Emily complained the lemonade wasn't cold enough. And now," Mark replied, "it legally belongs to her, unless we can prove the signature's fake." Somewhere deep in me, something shifted, like the first groan of timber before a house collapses. This wasn't just abandonment. It was an orchestrated extraction, like watching someone remove the organs from a life while leaving the skin intact. "Tell me what we need," I said. Mark gathered the papers back into his case. "We'll start with handwriting analysis. Bank records, dates, timestamps. She's sloppy when she's confident." After he left, the room felt smaller, as though the walls were leaning in to eavesdrop. My pillow was warm under my head, and for the first time I noticed the pattern of cracks in the ceiling paint. They spread outward from a single point, like veins, or like a map of how a life unravels from its center. I stared at the empty doorway where Mark had stood, and thought of Emily's precise handwriting on that goodbye note. The way she had pressed the pen so hard it left scars in the paper. And I wondered, almost with curiosity, had she been planning this before the diagnosis? Or did she only become this fearless after she thought I was already gone? Sandra found me in the corridor outside the oncology ward, sitting on a vinyl bench that hissed like a tired breath when I shifted my weight. I had been staring at a vending machine, wondering if grief could be traded for a bag of pretzels, when she appeared with her hair pulled back and her phone clutched like a confession. "Richard," she said quietly, "you need to hear this." We ducked into the staff cafe on the first floor of Stonemere Hospital. It smelled of burnt espresso and resignation. Sandra set her phone between us on the scratched table. The screen cracked at the corner like a spider web. She pressed play. At first, there was only the buzz of a cappuccino machine and chairs scraping tile. Then Emily's voice, smooth, careful, threaded through the noise. "Victor," she said, a soft laugh under the words. "He's almost gone. Just a few more months. Then we can finally live." Victor's reply was muffled, but his chuckle was the kind you imagine coming from someone adjusting a silk tie in a mirror. I felt my stomach tighten like a knot pulled too hard. "Play it again," I said. Sandra's thumb trembled as she rewound it. When Emily's voice came through the second time, It was sharper, each syllable cutting clean. "He's almost gone. We can finally live." I pressed my fingertips to my eyelids. The darkness behind them felt safer than light. The woman I'd built a home with on Maple Street, the mother of my 3 children, had already penciled me out of her calendar like an outdated appointment. Sandra spoke carefully, like stepping across glass. "I didn't mean to record it. She was meeting him at the cafe by the east entrance while I was getting my coffee." I recognized her voice. "You did the right thing," I said, though my voice sounded foreign. This proved something. What it proved, I wasn't sure yet. Only that the hollow space in my chest wasn't grief anymore. It was ignition. I stared at the black screen of her phone long after the audio ended, as if it might blink back to life and give me a reason this wasn't real. But silence only echoed what I already knew. This wasn't abandonment by impulse, it was design. And in that moment, with the hum of the hospital machines behind me and the faint scent of burnt coffee clinging to my gown, I realized she wasn't waiting for me to die. She was counting on it. The courthouse in Franklin County had the kind of silence that didn't belong to justice, but to waiting rooms and funeral parlors. I sat at the defense table in a borrowed gray suit that hung on me like an apology. The judge's gavel struck once, and in that hollow sound, my name was folded away like a canceled check. "Due to medical incapacity," she read from the file, "Mr. Richard Hale is declared legally incompetent to manage his estate or financial affairs." It was astonishing how a sentence could unmake you faster than any disease. One moment you are a man who once saved $80,000, replaced every roof shingle of a $180,000 home with your own hands. The next, you are a line in a ledger marked void. Mark Caldwell sat rigid beside me, jaw tight. "We'll appeal," he muttered. But it sounded less like strategy and more like comfort for the dying. Outside, the autumn wind clawed at the courthouse steps. I had to press my palm to the cold stone railing to steady myself, like anchoring to something that still believed I existed. 2 days later, a deputy arrived at Maple Street with a writ of possession. My house, my children's laughter still woven into the carpet fibers. He handed me the paper as though delivering a pizza. Transactional, impersonal. "Sir, you have to vacate," he said. "New ownership took effect last week." I stood in the living room, surrounded by furniture I had built. The cedar coffee table, the pine toy chest with Owen's initials carved into the lid. They felt like relics from someone else's life. When I didn't move, the deputy cleared his throat. "Do you need help packing?" I almost laughed. "Packing what? My belongings had already been emotionally repossessed." As he left, his boots thudded on the porch boards. The same boards I had replaced the summer Nora broke her arm. The summer Emily brought me lemonade with a kiss. And no hint of the deceit fermenting quietly behind her smile. I walked out with one duffel bag and a folder of hospital receipts, while the door closed behind me with the soft finality of a lid sealing on a box. By sundown, I was checked into a one-room motel off Highland Avenue, where the carpet smelled of bleach and defeat. The ceiling tiles were water-stained, brown halos spreading outward like quiet accusations. I lay on the stiff mattress staring up at those stains, and the thought came to me, cold and sharp. I was still breathing. My heart still drummed its stubborn rhythm, but on paper, on every piece of paper that mattered, I no longer existed. The attic above the pawn shop on Highland Avenue was the sort of place where even shadows seemed reluctant to settle. The single bulb buzzed like an irritated wasp, casting a jaundiced glow over a mattress thin enough to fold like a letter. The window rattled whenever trucks passed below, and the air carried the metallic tang of old coins and lost promises. It was $240 a month. Cash only. No questions. Which suited me. I had no answers worth giving. Nights blurred into each other. I'd sit on the floor with my back against the peeling plaster wall, hospital invoices spread around me like a paper graveyard. $3,217, $3,198, $2,964. The numbers grew heavier each time I read them, as though ink had gained weight. I stopped turning on the lamp, stopped checking my phone, stopped pretending that silence wasn't winning. Then came the fever. It started like a whisper in my bones, then roared. My skin burned while my teeth chattered as if trying to escape my mouth. I remember crawling down the narrow staircase to the pawn shop, the smell of machine oil thick enough to chew, and collapsing just inside the door. The owner called an ambulance not because he cared, but because he didn't want a problem on his floor. I woke in Stonemere Hospital again. Room 512 this time. 19 days blurred into antiseptic and gray ceilings. I watched the calendar on the wall shed pages like dry leaves. No one came. No Caleb, no Nora, no Owen. Sandra brought soup and small talk, her eyes careful not to meet mine too long, as if she feared drowning there. I called Emily once, straight to voicemail. I tried again the next day. The line went dead before the first ring. By the third attempt, the automated voice announced, "The number you are trying to reach is not accepting calls." She had blocked me. Efficient, clean, like deleting a file from a desktop. There was an odd clarity in that. Even pain loses its fangs when it realizes no one is watching. I stopped asking for the TV remote. I watched the IV drip instead, drop after drop, counting like a condemned man etching lines into stone. Somewhere in the second week, I realized my body was healing just enough to keep me alive, not enough to make me matter. I had become a background object, a hospital fixture that beeped. And lying there, with fever sweat cooling on my skin and the hum of the fluorescent light overhead, I thought, maybe this was what rock bottom really was. Not the fall itself, but the soundless space where even echoes give up. If this story touched something deep inside you, please like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. They discharged me on a Thursday afternoon, wheeling me out past the sliding glass doors of Stonemere Hospital with a plastic bag of medication, a folder of aftercare instructions, and exactly 87 cents in my wallet. The coins clinked like they were laughing at me. I stepped into the gray light, the parking lot shimmering with heat, and for the first time in months there were no machines keeping me alive. Only choice. Sandra walked me as far as the curb. She looked smaller out here, away from the soft glow of hospital corridors. "So," she said, adjusting her badge lanyard. "What now?" I almost said nothing. But then she placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "Then build again," she said. "You're a carpenter." It was such a simple sentence, almost absurd. Build what? My house had been stolen. My name had been erased. My children had been taught to live without saying my name, but the words lodged in me like a nail tapping at the right spot in old wood. I caught a bus to Cleveland that evening, the ticket $19.75, paid in crumpled bills I found stuffed in my jacket lining. The ride took 4 hours. The sun sagged into the horizon like a tired coin, and the world outside the window blurred into silhouettes of gas stations and rusted billboards. When I stepped off at the Greyhound Depot on Superior Avenue, the air smelled of diesel and wet pavement. I walked until my legs trembled and stopped at a warehouse with a handwritten sign. Night janitor needed. 11 each war. Apply inside. The supervisor was a man named Carl, who wore a flannel shirt the color of old ketchup and didn't look up from his clipboard when he said, "Mop's in the closet, don't steal the bleach." So I began. Nights alone with concrete floors and the hiss of fluorescent lights overhead. I swept between pallets of shrink-wrapped appliances, mopped the break room where someone had taped a joke cartoon to the fridge, and emptied trash bags that slumped like defeated men. It was mindless work. Perfect. My hands needed something to hold besides regret. Each shift I saved every penny. After 2 weeks, I had $156 folded inside an envelope under my pillow at the cheap motel. Not much, but money, unlike hope, did not lie. It was a beginning. There was a quietness to those nights that felt like training. I found myself standing straighter, breathing deeper, as if my bones were testing whether they could carry me again. And somewhere between the smell of disinfectant and the hum of machinery, a thought flickered. This was not an ending. It was the first quiet spark of a revenge story, though I didn't dare call it that yet. Not out loud. Not while it was still fragile as a match in wind. But even the smallest ember knows what it wants, to burn its way back into light. Morning came in slivers through the torn blinds of my motel room on Superior Avenue, laying stripes of light across the cheap carpet like yellow caution tape. I started moving again. Not quickly, not gracefully, but stubbornly. Each dawn, I forced my body through push-ups that made my arms shake like loose scaffolding and jogged the cracked sidewalks behind the warehouse before my night shifts. It was comical, really, an ex-homeowner turned ghost janitor doing squats beside overflowing dumpsters. But even ghosts need legs if they plan to haunt anyone properly. My paychecks came in thin and creased, $440 every 2 weeks. After rent, instant noodles, and the occasional pack of socks from the dollar store, I tucked away $300 a month in a battered metal cash box under the mattress. Numbers, unlike people, didn't lie to me. They were small, but they stayed. In the evenings, when the world slowed enough to hear my own breath, I sat at the wobbly desk and drew a calendar on the wall. Each day, I marked an X. Each Sunday, I wrote a single word across the coming week in red marker. Justice. It looked almost childish, like a teenager carving freedom into a desk, but it anchored me. It told me who I still was under the rubble. One night, after mopping the echoing halls of the warehouse, I returned to the motel to find a message blinking on the screen of the ancient laptop Sandra had scrounged from the hospital lost and found. The subject line read, "Dad?" The sender, Caleb. I clicked it with trembling fingers. Is it true? Are you alive? I stared at the words so long they blurred. He had typed them like someone afraid the answer might break him. I thought of his voice on the phone months ago. Quiet and too old, whispering about Emily and Victor like a secret he wasn't sure he was allowed to tell. My son had mourned me while I was still breathing. And who could blame him? When even I had stopped acting alive, I typed back slowly. Yes, I'm here. Not whole, but here. Then I closed the laptop and sat in the silence, my pulse steady, my breath even. Outside, the neon motel sign buzzed and flickered as if trying to pronounce my name. For the first time in a year, I let myself believe the world might learn to say it again, too. Mark spread the files across the cracked laminate table in his cramped office on West 9th Street, like a magician laying out a grim deck of cards. The blinds were half broken, letting in a slice of Cleveland winter light that made everything look like evidence, even the coffee mugs. These, he said, tapping the forged property transfer deed with the back of his pen, will bury her case if we can prove they're fake. The signature curve's wrong here. See? Like someone trying to imitate confidence. I leaned closer. The swirl of the R in my name looked unfamiliar, like a stranger trying on my skin. She signed it 3 days after I was admitted, I said, voice steady but low. I was hallucinating ceiling squirrels. I couldn't have signed my own name if you'd paid me. Which, Mark said, flipping to a bank statement, makes this even better. $78,200 transferred out of your joint account that same morning. He slid the page toward me. the inked numbers cold as handcuffs. He opened a thumb drive next, plugging it into his laptop. And then there's the recording Sandra gave you. Emily telling Victor you were almost gone. That's intent, Richard. Malicious intent. Hearing her voice again in that room was like swallowing glass. He's almost gone. We can finally live. The words seemed to hang above the table, whispering through the dust. Mark closed the laptop gently, as though shutting a coffin. Then he looked at me, his expression sharpening. We don't fight this with fists, he said. We fight it with paper, with signatures and dates and the weight of proof. I met his gaze. For months, I had felt like a shadow flung loose from its body. Now, seeing the web of dates, transfers, forged loops of ink, it felt like picking up the hammer I'd dropped when the world fell apart. Then let's build something she can't burn, I said. Mark gave a brief nod. Good, because this is where it stops being tragedy and starts becoming strategy. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, each page trembling slightly in my hands like planks about to become a frame. Beneath the ruin, something was taking shape again, and for the first time, the thought didn't scare me. The envelope was ivory, thick as pressed petals, with my name etched in looping gold script, as if death had improved my handwriting. It arrived at Mark's office on West 9th Street, slipped under the door like a rumor. Mark slit it open with his penknife and read silently, his brows inching up. Margaret Green, he said at last, handing it to me like it might explode. Inside was a card edged in gilt. In honor of Richard Hale, posthumously, Gala for the fallen heroes of New York City. I let out a dry laugh that scraped my throat. Posthumously. They're going to toast me like I'm a commemorative statue. Mark gave me a long look. They think you're dead, Richard. Good, I said, folding the invitation with care. Then let's give them a ghost. The absurdity of it almost made me smile. Emily would be there. Margaret was her cousin, after all. I could picture her arriving draped in silver silk, Victor hovering at her elbow, both wearing that effortless smile people use when they think they've erased the past. They would clink glasses over the life they had dismantled while I stood unseen just outside the glow. But not this time. This time I wouldn't be the ghost haunting the edges. I would walk into that ballroom breathing and watch their perfect script crack like old paint. Mark tapped the table. We need timing, logistics, evidence queued. You show up, and the moment you're seen, this becomes more than family drama. It becomes leverage. I know, I said, sliding the card into my jacket. Let them mourn me tonight. He studied my face for a moment. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, I said. They remember who built the house they buried me in. If this journey stirred your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It's the fuel that lets us keep creating more. The chandeliers at the Astoria Grand blazed like captive suns, scattering light over crystal glasses and sequined gowns, as if trying to blind the room to its own hypocrisy. Waiters floated past in black vests, their trays glittering with champagne and amnesia. My rented tuxedo felt like armor that didn't quite fit, the collar digging at my throat as I watched the ballroom from the shadowed archway. Emily arrived fashionably late, of course. She wore a red dress that clung like entitlement, her arm looped through Victor's as if he'd been grafted there. They were laughing at something small and expensive. I could almost admire it, their choreography of triumph, if it weren't built on the corpse they thought I had left behind. Margaret Green took the stage, her voice swelling through the microphone with the solemn weight of curated grief. Tonight, we honor those who gave everything and are no longer with us. My name appeared on the massive screen above her. Richard Hale. In memoriam. Applause rolled through the crowd like distant thunder, and then Caleb saw me. He was standing by the side table, taller than I remembered. His hair swept back in a way that made him look halfway to the man I had always hoped he'd become. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble. "Dad," he said, not loud but loud enough to crack the air. Heads turned. The applause died mid-clap. I stepped forward from the archway, each footstep slow, deliberate, echoing like hammer strikes across a coffin lid. Emily's smile froze, still stretched, but hollowed out. Victor's arm twitched at her side like a puppet string gone slack. "Surprise," I said, voice dry as old timber. "Seems I was only dead on paper." A ripple of whispers tore through the room, confusion unraveling in real time. Margaret stood frozen at the podium, her mouth shaping the word alive without sound. Caleb moved first. He broke from the crowd and ran to me, colliding against my chest so hard it made my ribs ache. His shoulders shook. "You're here," he choked. "You're really here." I held him, feeling the boy and the man inside him collide like tectonic plates. Over his head, Emily's eyes met mine. No tears, no gasp. Just a flicker of calculation. The look of someone watching their elegant tower of cards realize the wind has changed. The chandeliers blazed on, relentless, as if trying to erase the shadow that had just walked back into their light. The ballroom at the Astoria Grand had gone silent enough to hear the air conditioning hum when I took the stage. My hands were steady, almost unnervingly so, as I set the slim black briefcase on the podium like a carpenter placing the first nail. Behind me, the massive screen still bore my name in gold letters beneath the word "In Memoriam," which felt poetic in a bleak, bureaucratic way. "Since we're celebrating my death," I said, my voice carrying across the marble like a slow saw through hardwood, "it seems only fair you know what it cost." I opened the case and pulled out the first file. The forged deed from Maple Street, blown up on the projector screen, my fake signature curling like smoke in the corner. Gasps fluttered through the crowd. This was signed 3 days after I was admitted to Stonemere Hospital. I was too busy vomiting and hallucinating squirrels on the ceiling to be buying or selling real estate. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the room. Brief, nervous, then gone. I held up the next sheet. The bank transfer slip. $78,200 from our joint account. The same morning she told our children their father was gone. The screen flashed the transaction, time-stamped and sharp as a verdict. And then, the recording. Emily's voice filled the hall, smooth and careful as a scalpel. "Victor, he's almost gone. Just a few more months. Then we can finally live." The words hung in the air like the smell of ozone before lightning strikes. Emily's face drained of color, her red dress suddenly looking more like a warning light than triumph. She stepped back, eyes darting to the exits, but Victor was already moving, bolting toward the side doors with the panicked grace of a man who knows the walls are closing in. A waiter leapt aside as Victor's elbow sent a champagne tower crashing in a rain of glass. The crowd erupted, phones out, flashes popping, the sound of whispers sharpening into accusations. Margaret's jaw was locked as if she were chewing gravel. I let the silence after the chaos stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. "You built this web," I said, looking straight at Emily. "You just forgot spiders get caught in their own silk, too." And for the first time in years, she had no words. The courtroom in Franklin County Courthouse was packed the morning the verdict came down. The air tight with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for lottery drawings or public executions. Mark sat beside me, his tie crooked, eyes sharp. Across the aisle, Emily wore a navy suit that probably cost more than my first pickup truck, her expression fixed somewhere between defiance and denial. Victor was nowhere to be seen. Apparently his survival instinct had finally outpaced his vanity. Judge Reynolds adjusted her glasses, the paper in her hand trembling only slightly as she read. "This court hereby nullifies the fraudulent transfer of the property located at Maple Street, restoring ownership to Mr. Richard Hale. Furthermore, the respondent, Emily Hale, is ordered to pay damages in the amount of $200,000. The words landed like bricks in the room. I exhaled slowly, the way you do when you've been holding your breath for a year, and are trying not to make it obvious. Emily blinked twice, as if someone had just unplugged her reality. Mark leaned toward me, whispering, "Congratulations. You just became the most expensive mistake she's ever made." A laugh nearly escaped me. Dark, quiet, the kind you keep locked in the cellar. I rose as the judge banged the gavel, the sharp crack of it echoing through my ribs like a finishing nail driven home. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, questions crackling in the air like static. Emily slipped out a side door, heels striking the tile like a retreat drumbeat. I turned to the microphones at the steps outside, sunlight spilling down the courthouse facade. Caleb stood a little apart from the crowd, watching me with a hesitant pride that made my throat ache. I gripped the railing and spoke, my voice steady, carrying over the chaos. "I did not survive," I said, to stay silent. And for the first time since the diagnosis, the world listened as if I was real again. The kitchen smelled of butter and warmth again. The griddle hissed as I flipped another pancake, its edges crisping into gold. Sunlight slanted through the windows of the Maple Street house, pooling on the floor where Caleb, Nora, and Owen sat cross-legged, arguing over who got the first plate. They had grown taller, sharper around the edges, yet their laughter still rang like it used to. High, unguarded, echoing down the hallway I once thought would never hold their voices again. "Make them extra fluffy, Dad," Nora called, grinning like she knew I would. "Mine had chocolate chips last time," Owen added, solemn as a judge. Caleb just smiled at me, eyes soft, like someone still making sure this wasn't a dream. I stacked the pancakes high, the syrup glinting in the sun like amber caught mid-drip. And for the first time in years, the silence between us was the good kind, the kind that comes when nothing is missing. The house no longer felt like evidence. It felt like home. I thought of the man who had stood on courtroom steps declaring he wouldn't stay silent, the man who had dragged himself from motel carpets and hospital floors to this morning light. I thought of Emily's face when the web she wove collapsed, and how every thread of her deceit had only made my return louder. There are stories where victory is loud, filled with fireworks and speeches. But sometimes, winning looks like 3 kids reaching for pancakes while sunlight washes over the table like forgiveness. Dignity, I realized, can be stolen for a while, but never destroyed. It waits, like embers under ash, until you are ready to breathe on it again. If you liked this story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about this journey in the comments. Thank you for spending this time with me. Wishing you health, peace, and a home full of laughter. If this story stirred something in you, stay close. In the next chapter, we'll peel back another perfect family portrait and reveal the hidden cracks that could swallow it whole.